Okay, you guys ready?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah,
Cool.
we're already quivering with anticipation.
This is the worst sneeze.
Good bit.
That's
Let's
good.
get
That's
going.
good. That's good. That's a good cold open.
That's it. You did it for us. You did it, Michael. That's it. All right, so welcome to another episode of Cinema Symposium. Today we are going to be reviewing Rocky Horror Picture Show, but first we have a guest returning for the third time. Thea, welcome back.
Hi.
Hello.
Welcome back.
So good to be here. Lovely.
Yeah.
Love all of you.
Thea's been here for 2 other episodes. She's been here for What We Do in the Shadows and for... I can't remember yeah, it's Over the Garden Wall. I keep forgetting Over the Garden Wall. But yes, thank you for coming back for 3 of these. It's been a really fun series. We're almost done with it too.
Yeah, you guys have almost done it. You've almost made it through.
I got 2 more movies to watch.
I'm so proud of you guys.
I got 1 more movie to watch.
I have 1.5.
Well, let's get into it. The Rocky Horror Picture Show. In what became known as possibly the best B-movie of all time, a newly engaged couple have a breakdown in an isolated area and must seek shelter at a bizarre residence of Dr. Frank N. Furter, starring Tim Curry, Susan Sarandon, Barry Bostwick, and supported by one of the most enthusiastic supporting casts I've ever seen.
So I have had an interesting journey with this movie. I almost feel as though it's maybe inaccurate to call it a B movie, because I feel as though most of the things that are obscure and weird and bizarre out there are such intentional choices. That is not really so bad it's good. Like, any things that seem bad that are happening almost always are intentional jokes. I don't know whether I can really call those bad things. I am in a position, I don't know how unique or common this is, in which many of my friends heard about the massive cult following for this movie. There are a few movies with a stronger cult following than Rocky Horror Picture Show. And heard about all the, movie theaters that play it and the big watch parties that happen, reproductions on stage and all that. And that they watched it and they were not big fans of it at all. Just didn't connect with it for whatever reason. And they appreciated that people appreciated it, but that's it. It reminded me of a video I watched not too long ago about this guy who could not for the life of him really appreciate silent comedies, like the old silent films like Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, all that. Because when these films were made, they were accompanied with massive orchestras that had instrumental music that would follow along each step of the film. And when you go to these theaters and have these orchestras, like people do now, they actually have tours that they take, the revivals, where they show these old classic films and have orchestras with them, and everybody watches it together. It was a completely different experience for him. He loved them. And I think it's maybe a disservice for this generation in a lot of ways to have seen Rocky Horror. In the sense that for us now, watching a movie is staying at home, often alone, often with our phones, on a TV screen and watching something on Netflix or Amazon or HBO. And I looked it up. There was a 15-year gap between the film premiere of Rocky Horror Picture Show and the first home release of Rocky Horror Picture Show. Which is crazy. 15 years is a long time to not be able to watch this really whenever you want to. So I went into it with that perspective, and I really appreciate it. It's not the same movie for me as it is for a lot of people. I really respect and appreciate what this film did for queerness and gender nonconformity and exploring yourself and your sexuality and all these different concepts and themes. Obviously, not all of it necessarily applies to me in the way that I needed this as a solace or a refuge or a way of accepting myself in a community that did not accept me. But I really respect that it has been that for people. But yeah, I really enjoy it. For me, at least, it does meander a little bit, but there's a ton of really funny moments, a lot of really creative moments, and I always respect any art form that just creates new things and doesn't really follow any other traditional rulebook and pays homage to other films and genres, but still makes something wholly and completely new.
So this being my first time watching it, I decided from the get-go just kind of let it watch over me. I know a tad bit about how it became like a huge midnight movie, like everywhere, but I didn't know exactly what the story had going in. I only knew like a couple songs out of context. I didn't even know that Time Warp had a tab number. Honestly, I wasn't let down by anything in this movie. You could tell from just looking at the behind the scenes of this movie and the way that people are even acting in this movie that everyone has just such a fun time creating it.
I'm not setting out to shock anybody, really. But then again, I never have been, but I seem to have in various other things that I've done. The fact that Frankenstein is now wearing a corset might sort of keep them entertained long enough.
I play Frankenfurter. He is a kind of new variation on the mad scientist of horror films that we all know and love.
Like we said with Evil Dead 2, I feel like that everything that they do is really intentional. Down to the way that people act, down to the way that people like react to things, to the way that even Barry Bostwick portrays Brad.
Hi, my name's Brad Majors. This is my fiancée, Janet Weiss.
Which I don't know where they found him because he sounds like he's from a different era the way he speaks. It's fantastic. The only real problem that I had with it was Frankenfurter himself, where there are times, there are two seduction scenes that could be taken as metaphor, but taken as literally, it can be taken as potential. Like, if taken as metaphorically, it makes sense. It's like a sexual awakening for both characters, and they're like kind of hesitant towards it, but then they realize that they're actually for it. But also I have a problem with Frankenfurter at the end being portrayed as some form of hero in some light. Because Frankenfurter is, in fact, a villain towards them throughout the whole movie. One of the most fabulous villains of all time, but still like a villain. But all in all, I really enjoyed this film. And I feel like I understand why it became a classic. And knowing what little I know about it, I really enjoy it.
I went into this film, I've seen it before. I've seen it 3 other times, but always on the big screen with actors, and like I go and I see the whole production. And honestly, it's like one of my all-time favorite things to go do. But I wanted to sit down and watch this movie for the first time by itself, just as a film, and I wanted to try to separate not just what I know of the live production, but also its historic context and cultural impact from the actual film itself. And I very, very quickly realized that that is completely impossible for me. And so I decided to just lean into it as I was watching it. And I think it's impossible for a lot of people. You have this movie that was so far ahead of its time, plot-wise, character-wise, theme-wise, that it literally got pulled from theaters almost immediately after it came out. And the only reason that it lived on was because of alt and queer and LGBTQ+ communities kind of adapting it onto the late night scene, where you already had stuff like drag coming into play in like very early years. Obviously it kind of got adapted into that world. And when you think about it from that perspective, and you know the history of the production, the theater production before it was a movie, you see why it was so offensive and why it is still so relevant now. Because you literally have the very beginning of this film being the setup for the traditional, classic, conservative, pure 70s Christian, cis white movement. And then you have these two characters quite literally being put into a completely different world where the characters are quite literally aliens because they're not cis. And when you look at it from that perspective, it's, forgive my language on here, fucking mind-blowing, okay? That this film has still stuck around, that it has the history that it does. I can't separate the two personally. And so that's really what I came away from it appreciating the most, is just how well they did explore these themes in the story. That being said, I did come away having even bigger problems with some of the more problematic elements than I typically do when I'm seeing it live, because when you're seeing it live, there's a lot going on. You're not really paying attention to every single detail that's happening. People are shouting things at the screen, but I completely agree with both Michael and Jordan that the coercive, we're going to put that in quotation marks, sensual scenes are disturbing, I think, personally. Although I get the different ways they can be interpreted, so nobody come for me or anyone else on here, please. Oh, I also made a note of the outdated lingo just for anyone who hasn't seen the film that might be watching this, because that is not the fault of the writer, because that was a different age and time, and that lingo was what they were using at the time as kind of a way to reclaim their identities, but now is very outdated and shouldn't be used. So like, that's just Mother Time's fault. That's nobody's really. And also the pacing I had a little bit more of a problem with this time around, just because you didn't have the live production happening in front of you and there wasn't as much happening, which is what I'm personally used to. And so this time around, I was like, I get why they have the whole quiet dinner scene, but it killed me. Okay. It was so long. The be-all end-all of it is that the themes are incredible. There are still some problematic elements, just like a lot of these older films have. But ultimately, I think that its cultural impact definitely outweighs some of its more negative qualities.
This was my first time ever seeing this film. Overall, absolutely loved it. For the most part, like start to finish, it was pretty good. And it is interesting, Thea talking about how she was unable to separate it from sort of its cultural following. And what was interesting for me watching it, even as someone who's not really not a part of those communities and someone who's never seen it live and never been part of the cult following or anything like that, even I recognized immediately the themes and the stories it was trying to tell and its place and the conversation about these communities and all that kind of stuff. And so even for me, as being removed from the following of this film as you probably could be, I even found it tricky to separate those things, because it is that monumental of a film and part of that conversation that I think there's no way of separating that and just viewing it as a film in itself. So yeah, I was amazed and blown away by how forward-thinking and progressive it was, and given that it felt in a lot of ways, with the exception of a couple of the problematic terminologies and things like that, it still feels like a film that could be made now. Like, and it feels like a film that could be made in 2020 and still feel progressive even for 2020. So yeah, I was blown away. I was also just blown away by just in general, just the sets, the costumes, Tim Curry's performance, just the eccentricity of the whole cast and their excitement to be there. Like Jordan said, there's a lot to love in this film, and I'd like to watch it again, see what more there is to see.
I think Nathaniel makes a really good point about how this movie would still be fairly experimental and progressive today. And there's several like tropes I've seen in different books I've been reading, whether it's literal or satire, about characters who are bisexual but are forced to present themselves as either gay or straight, because bisexual is confusing to shareholders.
You know Mavis bi, right?
Yeah, you know what? I just feel like lesbian is a bit of an easier sell, a bit more cut and dry.
Americans are more accepting of gays when they're in a clear-cut gender role relationship, like Ellen and Portia.
Or, the mass market appeal. And it would really, I can't think of a major studio today, if you said, hey, we want an ensemble, and all of them are fairly ambiguous and very non-binary and very experimental, and when you look at them, you can't help but just see people, because there is so much going on.
It was interesting to me that this film was rated R, when really, I don't know that this same film would be rated R today. Like, there's so little, like, there's like no language in it, and there's so little actual like explicit sexuality in it. It's all just just the vibe and kind of perceived and stuff. And it was just, that was added onto a layer that surprised me about this film, because I'd only been familiar with sort of the culture around the film. I found it a much more like normal film than I expected. Like, it was a far more just straightforward regular movie than I expected going into it.
Overall, I think that this is a film that everyone should see at least once, but it's not going to be for everybody. I think that the people that it is for really feel a sense of homecoming, and they feel this like warmth in their chest when they see it for the first time, especially if they go to something like the live production and you're around a bunch of people that are like you, especially if it's for the first time or the first time in a while. But I will say that I fully acknowledge, even as a super fan, that it is not for everybody. And if it's not for you, then at least you've seen a great film that's a cult classic and, you know, that really challenges and pushes gender roles. And it's definitely a storyline that gender is not necessary and doesn't even really exist. And I think that anyone can hopefully appreciate that there's at least one movie like that out there. Good, but not for everybody. It is for me.
Big fan of this movie. I was glad I watched it. Really impressed with the story it tells and the themes it explores, especially being almost 50 years old now. Surprisingly progressive, I think, given its time period. But yeah, not without flaws, but I think it's definitely, I see why it's an important film, and I'm glad that I watched it.
I really agree with you. I recommend that this is almost just a litmus test for yourself. I recommend that everybody see this just to learn more about yourself and the way you process movies. I think it's important to see this film not only as a historical piece, but like as a pretty much like a miracle of film, in the sense that it was able to transgress so many boundaries and overcome so many social norms, not just for that time, but for this time. As we've all said multiple times, this film would still be considered very daring and experimental, and a miracle that it's made even today, and even especially today. It does so much new and so daringly and boldly. It's worth seeing, even if just for that. Even if you don't relate to these themes and characters and ideas, if you don't relate to the story, I feel like you could, or at least should, connect to that experimentation and that a film was able to go that far. To me, this is just in line with so much of the experimental avant-garde film, like John Waters. It reminds me a lot of John Waters.
I can see that, yeah.
And the experimentation that happened with like Pink Flamingos and all that, of just, for good or bad, pushing boundaries in film and getting us to that point where we can experiment more and provide more with film.
I was never frightened to try new stuff, because that's what people expect if they come to see my show. They want to be taken sometimes into a world that they might feel uncomfortable with, and I'm their guide, though. Because I don't think I'm mean. I might ask you to consider something, but I don't think, if I'm trying to shock, I'm trying to make you laugh at the same time. Because I'm still amazed by things that I don't understand. That's what always interests me, that there is no clear answer to it. It's easy to shock people. It's much harder to make them laugh.
And even though it's not necessarily one of the dearest or closest held films to me, I respect it so much for what it's done and the tracks it's laid down for films that I do love.
Yeah, like I said, going into it blind, I had no clue what to expect. I think it is better than I expected it to be, but I do feel like it opened up a lot of doors. Like Michael said, pushing boundaries, or like we all said, just like it set up so much for like future films to be able to do like that much more, and like does it more restrained than we've seen other movies do, especially like from 60s, 70s, and 80s, where there was like random nudity just popping like out of nowhere, where this is like I would say slightly more restrained in that area. Its message is very evident, and I think it is overall a positive message, where it's clear even just by looking at their ensemble that there are things that are similar with each one of them, but if you look at them individualistically, they have something special about them, something that makes them stand out, and something that makes them all together work very well.
So I'll remove the cause, but not the symptom.
That is our episode of Rocky Horror Picture Show. Thank you for stopping by. Like, share, subscribe. It's good to see people actually commenting below. That's even like one person commenting. We'll respond because we have no one else to focus on.
I want you, one person who commented on our video of Monster Squad, to recognize we care. We talked about this before the podcast, that you commented, because you're amidst the first. And we really appreciate that. And we really appreciate Thea for coming on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming on. Would you like to plug your stuff again?
Yes, always. I love a self-plug. I write a audio fiction Southern Gothic horror podcast that you can find on all podcast platforms. It is called That Creepy Podcast. Nathaniel himself is in it as one of the main characters. He does a great job. It is super fun, creepy, eerie, and I actually recommend it to people who both love horror and people who don't like horror, because I think that I have successfully done some hybrid genre fancy writing stuff to it, and it has become something that, mostly everyone can enjoy in one way or another, although it is on the eerie side. For personal writing stuff, you can go to theadora.me. For all my personal stuff, I will be releasing a short story, non-linear, serialized carnival horror short story kind of thing soon, and I'm really excited about that.
Wow.
So lots of cool things coming out. And yeah, podcast platforms. It has a nice red cover, and my website. Those are going to be the two best things to follow me on. I also have social medias, which I always forget to mention because my social medias I basically use as journals more than, connecting with people, which is probably a bad decision on my part. But yeah, my Instagram in particular is at Saint Theodora, and then the podcast also has an Instagram, which is at That Creepy Podcast. So hopefully we'll see you there at some point.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us for another one of our episodes. Tomorrow we got another one. It's like one of our last two in this little run that we got going. The next one we got coming up is by director Bong Joon-ho. I adore that director. It is The Host, and we'll be featuring one of my older friends. His name is Damon Lee. You're going to want to tune in. It's going to be fun. Exciting stuff. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Guys.
Love you guys. Bye.
Patience.
Oh, God.
That's good. Bring it a full circle.
That's the stuff.